Hi, everybody. Wow. Welcome back. It's Monday at 1 o'clock Israel time, and we're back to we are at our weekly examination of part of Pirkei Avot, historically, theologically, philosophically, practically. I'm glad you were able to make it, and let's get started. We're very excited here in Israel, those of you who don't live here, because we're expecting the first really significant snowstorm um, in a number of years. I think the last really serious one was like 7 years ago, when really the entire country got socked. And here in Gush Etzion, we're expecting to have at least a day or so where we're going to be difficult to get around. But it's very exciting. We don't have snow that often. This is not the United States or Italy, where snow is a more normal, more typical occasion. But it actually the anticipation of snow actually relates directly to the Mishnah that we're going to talk about. We started last week discussing the three aphorisms that are attributed to Shammai. Shammai, as we saw, was the partner of Hillel at the head of the Pharisaic party, at the head of the sages of the oral law, around the end of the first century BCE and the beginning of the first century CE, because as we all know, there's no year zero in the Common Era. And Shammai was known for saying three things. One, or he had three slogans, or three, which I don't know what to call them, slogans. That's probably the best way to put it. Three aphorisms. Asay Torah Chakeva, make your Torah study fixed. We talked about that a lot last week. And today we're going to discuss his comment, and more ma'at v'aseh harbe. Talk a little less and do more. Say less and do more. Say little and do more. The reason why it's connected with the upcoming snow is because I just happened on the radio, and Israel is very much still a radio country, for those of you who don't know. The mayor of one of the major cities was sitting there. Actually, mayors of two cities, Tzfat and Yerushalayim, were both saying, well, we're going to do this, and we're going to do that, and we're going to do the other thing, in terms of preparation for the snow and when the snow comes and so on. Now that's very helpful and it's very reassuring, but I had a little bit. I was somewhat concerned in as I was sort of putting the last touches on today's lecture, today's talk, because oy vavoy, woe is to that, woe are they if all of the things they're putting into place are not going to happen, because it'll be hell to pay. And I think that highlights part of the problematics of this Emor Ma'at Basei Harbe. There's a natural tendency on the part of all of us to get carried away with ourselves and to talk and talk and talk and talk and talk, and to say I'm going to do this and I did that and so on and so on. And the more that there's any kind of distance between what you're promising and what you intend and what you think and what you actually get done or what you actually have done, the more trouble you're going to be. And that raises a serious, it's not for now, but that raises a serious issue. Is there room for a person who is moral, a person who's ethical, a person who wants to live his life according to Pirkei Avot? Never mind the idea of a person who's actually religious and cares about these things, to go into politics. Because the natural thing is to say, is make all kinds of bombastic promises, and you end up doing very little. Now, even in the now, when it comes into putting things into practice, of course, you have coalition politics and you have to make deals and so on. But still, you don't want to get carried away. In fact, there were two professions which are directly related to questions of speech, which I've been asked on a number of occasions: is it possible for a person who is morally sensitive, or a person who is certainly a person who's God fearing, to go into it? One of them is journalism, and the other is politics. Journalism, because is it possible to avoid the rules against gossip and tale bearing and still be a journalist? Interesting question. And the other one is politics, because you end up, first of all, you have to make all kinds of shady deals. It's part of the deal, part of the profession. But also, emor ma'ad v'aseh harbeh. You don't get ahead of yourself. And if a more and also emor ma'ad v'aseh harbeh, in terms of politics, would mean that you should get a lot done, but you shouldn't call attention to yourself. But that's the opposite of what a politician needs. A politician needs maximum exposure. On the contrary, if a politician does anything, he'll take credit, or she'll take credit. Absolutely no, there's no discrimination between men and women in this. They'll take credit for things which they didn't do, or to which their relationship was totally tangential. Because they need people's votes, and they need people to know who they are, and so on. So so I actually am very doubtful about either, whether a person who's truly moral and truly God fearing can be either a journalist or a politician. But others have tried and others have succeeded. So I guess I'm wrong, or at least they were willing to overcome the hurdles. But in any case, let's leave the snow to when it's supposed to come tomorrow night, and the career choices of budding young journalists and politicians to another discussion. Emor ma'ad v'aseh harbeh. What does it mean? Now, it's interesting. This is one of these wonderful, wonderful, wonderful examples of something I told you about Pirkei Avot. I've told you on a number of occasions. Point, and that is that the statement by Shammai is totally it's self-explanatory. What comment do I need to make? What kind of explanations are required? It's totally self-evident. Put your money where your mouth is, or keep your mouth shut and don't make bombastic promises when in fact you can't fulfill them. Or don't set yourself up for failure by making promises that either you can't keep, or that you might find it difficult to keep, which can make you look bad. So what is there to say here? I mean, fine. That's something everybody should know. And yet Shammai found it necessary to say. So what happens is, when the commentators come, very, very often they will say things which say more about themselves than about the words, because the words will bear all kinds of meanings and all kinds of implications. And they basically will say, well, the commentators through the ages will in fact say things regarding how they interact with those words. In other words, they'll tell you a lot about the world in which they live, which is one of the ways in which the commentaries to Pirkei Avot are as much instructive. They're so instructive as sort of an insight into how other people interacted. It gives you an opportunity to look into somebody else's head, and another person's age, another person's concerns in a different time, in a different place, and understand, wow, that's what bothered them, and it says something about them. It might be relevant to me, it might not, but it's a fascinating way of looking how other people interact with the same words differently at different times. So I'll give you one example, which is contemporary, and relates actually to a class that I had the opportunity to give in Mexico City last Thursday night, although I was sitting in this chair and so on. It was on Zoom. One of the comments, I've on a number of occasions, I've actually recommended this commentary on Pirkei Avot, which is written by my friend Professor Zev Safrai. It's part of a series called Mishnat Eretz Yisrael, the Mishnah of the Land of Israel, in which he tries to put the Pirkei Avot into its social and intellectual and religious and political context in the centuries, the first centuries before the Common Era and the centuries after the Common Era, leading up to the finalization of the Mishnah around the year 210, 220. So Professor Safrai, it's interesting, says that Emor ma'at v'aseh harbeh means that when you study, he tries to find sort of a thematic link which puts together all three parts of the Mishnah. So what did Shammai say? Shammai said, make your Torah fixed, just say little and do much, and then greet everybody cheerfully. So he puts the first two together anyways, and he says when you're studying Torah, theoretically, you can come up with all kinds of possibilities, especially when it comes to halacha, especially when it comes to law. And Shammai, in general, as I mentioned last week, was very much a legal conservative. Shammai is actually very is associated with the school that actually came out of that he founded, or that came out of his teachings, was one that tended to be stricter, tended to be harsher, tended to try to emphasize doing without, or erring on the side of caution, and so on. Nevertheless, says Professor Safrai, when he was very much a self-aware individual, and he says that, yes, you can, you even if your natural inclination is lahachmir, is to be strict in the implication, in the interpretation of the law of the Torah and the way that we live. Nevertheless, it would be, you really shouldn't overdo it. Even he says you shouldn't overdo it. Not too many chumras, not too many strictures. You should try to do more. You should try to be more practical in your orientation. Okay, so it's a very, it's, in other words, so it's a sort of a statement coming, sort of trying to accommodate himself more with the position of his partner Hillel, who was known for being more easygoing, for being more lenient, for believing in a position that was openly and effectively advocated, for example, by Rav Avad Yosef, Zecher Tzadik Livracha, Kocha de Torah Adif, that the Torah is a very big challenge and that we should try to make it as livable as possible. And so even Shammai, according to Professor Safrai, is trying to go in that direction, because he realizes that people have to live. People have to live in this world, and that you can't always be strict with them. Okay. Now, what's striking is that nobody else, I found no other commentary, absolutely no other commentary, and I looked at a dozen, 2 dozen. Nobody else says that. Nobody else comes up with this interpretation, and it's somewhat forced. The truth is, because if I say put your money where your mouth is, or don't, say don't talk so much but do stuff, who's going to connect it with chumrot, with being strict? I suggest that you have that in this observation by Professor Safrai, you have a great example of how contemporary concerns color the way a commentary or commentator will look at the words in front of him, because there in the religious, in the Orthodox community, both abroad and in Israel, there is this concern that rabbis and that religious authorities are always going l'chumrah. They're always making life harder. They're always saying, no, you can't, or don't try this, or don't try that, or we have to be cautious, or we can't make a decision, or we can't do this, we can't do that, and therefore you always have to go without. And there's a very profound sense among many people that this is too much already. I mean, you don't have to be so machmir. People have to live. And that was Rav Ovadia's position. He said, look, sometimes the law is strict. Sometimes the answer is no. That's legitimate. But to always go and sit there and say that you always have to emphasize and accentuate the negative, that's not the way to go. It's supposed to be Torah Chayim. And I suggest that I'm not so sure if this is what Shammai intended, but I think that Professor Safrai is reflecting in seeing questions of chumrah in Shammai's statement, knowing that Shammai himself was a big machmir, always took not always. He normally took the stricter opinion, the harder opinion to implement. I think he's thinking more about his own time and the things that are concerning him, rather than what Shammai himself came up with. So you should always, when you look at commentaries on the Bible, on the Haggadah, we'll be talking about the Haggadah Shel Pesach as we come closer to Pesach. Hard to believe 6 weeks to Pesach. And on Pirkei Avot, as much as the Mefarshim, as much as the interpreters are concerned with what the words mean, they're also trying to tell you what's affecting them. How it's a story of an interaction, and I can make it very, very fascinating. Okay, so that's Professor Safrai. Interestingly, the general trend among the commentators over the generations is not in that direction. And they cut down to a number of different different sort of patterns, and I'll try to outline those patterns. Pattern number one is emor ma'at v'aseh harbe, that um, that there's sort of a pattern, if you actually can see it. If you take a look at the structure of this Mishnah, aseh Torah keva, make your Torah fixed, and then emor ma'at v'aseh harbe. And so do little, say little and do much, and then havei mekabel kol adam b'sever panim yafot, greet everybody nicely. That can be seen easily to parallel the statement of Shimon HaTzadik at the beginning of this chapter, where Shimon HaTzadik said, "Al shlosha dvarim ha'olam omed." The world sits on three things: Torah, avodah, gemilut chasadim. Torah, service of God or service in the temple, and acts of loving kindness. And that's exactly what he does here. Dasei Torah Keva tells you about Torah. And Mor Ma'at Vasei Harbe tells you about your worship of God, or the way that you implement God's God, or your service of God, your way you implement God's commandments in the world. And then number 3 is Havei Mekabel Kol Adam B'Sever Panim Yishfot. Greet people nicely. It's acts of loving kindness because the interaction between people. So let's isolate Emor Ma'at Vasei Harbe, and we'll see that in fact the commentaries basically all discuss how we treat other people, okay, or how we treat other people. So that would be Gemilut Chasadim, right? Answer is no, because mitzvot between man and his fellow man are as much a part of the divine worship as they're not in place of. Okay, they go side by side, but it's also an act of divine worship because Jewish. This Maimonides said. Rav Soloveitchik used to emphasize this a lot. The basis of Jewish morality is imitation of God. What the Christians in Latin call imitatio Dei, imitating God, or as the Rambam says, "V'alachta b'drachav chazal." We know what to do by looking at how God works in the world and following Him. So, worship of God is in fact imitation is part of worship because you accept God's the binding nature of God's commandments and example. So let's get down to business. So one line of interpretation is Emor Ma'at Vasei Harbe, be understated. Be understated. Try to understate what you're going to try to accomplish, and then do more than what you implied when you said that. From where do you derive that idea? So in other words, if I say, well, there are two classic examples. One of them actually is again imitating God. In the book of Genesis, you have the story of what's called the Brit Ben Abtarim, the pact or the covenant of the pieces. Avraham Avinu has a vision in which God comes to him and after he sacrifices some animals. And God says to him, "Know that your descendants are going to be strangers in a strange land, and these people are going to treat them terribly, and they're going to turn them into slaves, and they're going to afflict them, they're going to torture them, and afterwards I will punish those people who have afflicted and enslaved them, and I'll take them out with great wealth and bring them back to Israel, and so on and so forth." Okay, all the Torah says is I will judge, bring up for judgment the nation that enslaved them. So all the commentators say, "Whoa, he did a lot more than that." I mean, there were the 10 plagues, and there were the wonders, and there was the death of the firstborn, and there was the splitting of the Red Sea. I mean, that's a lot more than just saying. But Dan Anochi is a very modest, very restrained way of putting this, and so this group of commentaries says, that's the point. God, that's how God communicates. He understates what he intends to do, but he ends up doing a lot more than that. And the same thing with us. We should say, "Okay, I'll try to take care of it, or I'll do what I can, or whatever." And then you'd make damn sure you're going to do a lot more than you can. Or a lot more that might be implied by your statement. Interestingly, and raising other issues, At the same time as they quote this example of Emor Matvase Arbe, which is a divine attribute, okay, the commentaries like to quote the example of Abraham. When Avram Avinu was sitting, according to the beginning of Parshat Vayera, Vayera, right? Beginning of, I always get confused with Vayera and Vayera. Vayera is in Breshit and Vayera is in Shemot. Avram Avinu is sitting at the tent, and he's passing them by. It's hot. He's inside the flap because it's too hot outside. Must have been in the summer, and three passersby come by, and he invites them in, and he says, I'll give you some food. He says to the three. It turns out they're angels according to the Torah. But he says, "Al navoy come, rachatzu lavchem v'sadu lebchem. You'll eat a little bit. You'll have a nash, v'charta avoru, and then go on. But please stay and have a bite. Okay, it's a bite. What's a bite? Okay, have a bite." And then he goes running to Sarah. He says, "Whoa, go get the best. Go get What are we talking about? Get a sheep and get a this and get a that, and we'll have bread and we'll have make a whole suda, make a whole arucha, make a whole 5-course meal for these people." And says so. All of this group of meforshim say that's exactly the point. He said, have something, and then you really go out of your way. And that's a real Jewish, and that's actually something in terms of food, anyway. That's a very Jewish, thing. Say, come over have a cup of coffee. Now, I don't know anybody. I don't know any Jewish people who, if they invited you for coffee, are not going to give you 4 types of cake to go with it, because that's just understood. You give to eat. I had an aunt, my aunt Sylvia, whose yahrzeit was, I guess, last week, who invited us once to come over you'll have a bite. A bite was a 5-course meal. Okay, it just goes with that. You don't not do that. There are other communities, by the way, where this is not a business. I remember once being in I love this story. When I was a junior in college, I was elected to Phi Beta Kappa on the junior election, which was a big deal. So there was a class of my class had a class of like 2,000, and there were 8 of us who were elected to Phi Beta Kappa. So anyway, we were invited to the head of Phi Beta Kappa's home, and I went with some friends, especially with my friend, a friend who was Italian, and we're sitting there, and we got served nothing. There was like nothing. And because that just these people they were either cheap or their culture did not they say we will come over for nothing or come over for some refreshments, and you'll see there's some refreshments. They had little finger sandwiches that were the size of my finger, and that was it. We walked out. I remember my friend Joe looked at me and said, "Did you see what they served?" Well, I had to eat it because it wasn't kosher. You see what they served? He said, "My mother she'd slit her throat, she slit her wrists if she didn't get that kind of food." So it's not just Jews, but different cultures do things differently. So, but in any case, Emor ma'at v'aseh harbe, always underestimate what you're going to do. Now, it happens to be that's a nice way of being. It looks more generous. It's much more modest, and also you don't set yourself up. Say, I'm going to give you, but if you can't. So it's always better to lower your expectations or commitments, and then to do more than that, and then the other way. So that's one line of interpretation. Another line of interpretation has to do with the Emor ma'at v'aseh harbe, has everything to do with not bragging. People have a tendency, Jews have a tendency, when it comes to things other than food, to try to get the biggest bang for their buck, especially when it comes to money. This is especially egregious when it comes to tzedakah. For example, I was more for many years. You don't see it so much anymore. You don't see it really in synagogues in Israel, but in the diaspora, it's all the time that people make pledges for either it's Yom Kippur or whatever the case might be, and they make these bombastic, huge pledges with no intention ever of redeeming them. But it looks good. Oh, he donated so and so. But in Israel, there's a cynical. In Hebrew, there's a cynical expression: "Hu iftiach v'lo iftiach lekayem." He promised, but he didn't promise he was going to follow through. And Mormat Vasei Harbe is not just to do that. So understate what you're going to give, or give anonymously, but certainly don't take advantage of other people's um, don't take advantage of other people's or no wait, that's not the word. Don't help me. Don't don't get cheap. Don't get a cheap shot in the arm of admiration by other people by talking a good game and not intending to follow through. So it's not a question. It's not. In other words, it's one thing to say I really, if to be sincere about it, say I want to do this, this, and this, and this, and then get caught up and showed that in fact that you were incapable of doing it. You look bad. Even if you intend to, but it could be worse. You could sit there and say, I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that and I'm wonderful and on and on and on, and you have no intention to do it, but you want people to be very impressed with you. That is a very, very bad moral characteristic. That's a miserable moral characteristic, and is the sin of self-aggrandizement, which is the opposite of avodah, because avodah requires humility. And then I say we're getting to the end. The third line of interpretation of this Mishnah, this part of the Mishnah, is comes back to Torah, and that is that emor ma'at v'aseh harbe. Always know that when you are teaching Torah, if you're implementing Torah, if you're implementing policy, that there's the ideal, there's the theoretical, and then there's the world. And you have to have a very, very, very strong and developed sensitivity to the needs of others if you want to put policy into practice. Now, this can be on all kinds of things. Okay, if you have a more ma'at, if you're totally enslaved or totally committed, or ideologically or fanatically committed to a theory, you won't be able to implement it because no theory is totally, even in science, is totally implementable in the world without adjustment. It's the action, it's the interaction between theory and life where we live. And you have to be flexible about that. If you're only emor harbe, if you're only devoted to theory, if you're a fanatic and you demand that the reality bend itself and that people bend themselves to theory down to the last end. Now that will end up nothing more than disaster. I say but I think that the Torah theory is what it should be. Yeah, sometimes Torah superimposes itself on reality, but there's enough stretch and there's enough give and there's enough of a spectrum of positions in halacha or even hashkafa in philosophy to allow for a fruitful interaction wherein the Torah is accessible and doable without forcing people into Procrustean beds, without forcing them into mitot stone. How you do that's not easy, but if you insist on what's called Yikov Hadin Tahar, that you just blindly sort of like bulldoze yourself over everybody, that's not going to be good. So with that, if we understand the Mishnah that way, so in fact, Emor Ma'at Vasei Harbe actually grows nicely out of Asay Torah Chakeva. Make your Torah study fixed and firm and consistent and intellectually consistent and methodologically consistent. And more ma'at vasei harbe when it comes to applying Torah principles to life. This could be in halakha, this could be in morality or whatever. Take what you learned, but look at what goes on the ground, and what people require, what other factors which are legitimately taken into consideration when you apply policy requires, and then and the way that you do that is by looking at the people that you're teaching and looking at the people and what their needs are. Now, sometimes their needs will not be satisfied by the Torah. The Torah demands other things of them. But in general, you've got to look at a person straight in the eye and see who they are, and then judge accordingly. Now, it's interesting, and we'll close with this. Interestingly, when it comes to paskening shilas, for example, doesn't always mean going easy on people. It's one of the striking things which I've discovered over the years. We started the remarks today by discussing people who the tendency to always be strict and always leaving out and being hard on people. Sometimes the person that is asking you the question may want you to be strict with them. Maybe they don't want you to be lenient. Yeah, but you have to be Makael Kol Adam B'Sefer Pnei Yafot. You got to look them in the eye and be open to them and listen to them. And Sefer Pnei Yafot doesn't mean just smile. It means be ready to listen, be ready to internalize. I'll give you an example. I had a case like this many years ago. Guy comes to me, and he had just he was in the 12 months of mourning for one of his parents. I don't remember who. And he was invited to the wedding of a close friend, or a child of a close friend, and he wanted to know, can he go? And so I told him, that depending on the relationship, or depending on the familial relationship, that there are certain ways that it might be possible if you're not there when the music is on, and helping to. Rav Moshe Feinstein has a tshuva in which he describes various possibilities. But as we talked, it became very, very clear to me that this guy was very much broken up over his parents' passing, and he really didn't want to go. He wanted me to tell him, no, it's usher. I'm sorry, I can't help you. That's what they needed. And both possibilities are true. I could, easily have, if it was, I could easily have given him Rav Moshe's heter, which is totally allowance, which is totally legitimate. But this person wanted the chumrah. He needed the chumrah. He needed me to be strict with him and say it was prohibited. So in the act of teaching, you always have to tailor. Doesn't mean change the integrity of the Torah Chalila, but it means that present things in a way that the person you're responding to the person in front of you, and not to an object upon which you're imposing theory. And I think that's a lesson for a lot of different. I think it's a lesson for a lot of different parts of life. Certainly has to do with the professions. It certainly is true, and I'm sure that everybody here can figure out a way in which it's more appropriate for them. And that's exactly the point of this class. Okay, so we will end here. Everybody who is in Israel, if you haven't gotten vaccinated, get vaccinated. I put up on the Facebook page of the Tel Aviv International Synagogue an article that I published in Hebrew and in English, which grew out of our discussions here about why there's a religious obligation to get vaccinated. Because you're not just doing it for yourself, even though the Torah says you should take care of yourself, but also you're not allowed to harm other people. And if you don't get vaccinated, if you're able to, if you don't get vaccinated, you could end up infecting someone else, even if you don't get infected or you don't get sick. So, or you don't have symptoms. So please get vaccinated. Lechu lehitchasen, as we say. Those of you who are living in Chutz La'aretz, I hope that the vaccines will come to you soon, and that we'll all be able to get over this. Get past this very not easy time. And we will see you next week. This will be up on YouTube, on the Facebook, on my Facebook page, and at YU Torah in the matter of the next hour or so. If you have questions, you can always contact me on Twitter, on Facebook. I look forward to hearing your comments. And please, please, please share this if you think it's appropriate. We'll see you soon. Bye.